Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome to my white ink comparison. I'm going to be comparing these 5 white inks. I've got Memento Luxe Wedding Dress. I just bought it and opened it. Simon Says Stamp white ink. I've used this maybe one time. Color Box, brand new. This is actually the one I use all the time at home. And I just opened the package. I've got Hero Hues White Unicorn ink. And I've only used this a couple of times. And then Stampin' Up! I've had for a very long time, so it was really dried up. I went ahead and purchased the re-inker, and I inked it up last night, so that way it had some time to soak in before I did the review. So these are the 5 that I'm going to be reviewing. I'm going to stamp a detailed image, I'm going to stamp a solid image, I'm also going to stamp a sentiment. We'll compare all that. I'm going to be using black Stampin' Up! Paper. And then at the end, I think I'm going to do a direct paper test. So let's get started. So here's the chart I've created for the results. I have the names of all the inks at the top in alphabetical order, and I'm just going to be stamping down as I go. Now for this first row, it's going to be the detailed stamp, and I've decided to use this flower from the Altenew set called Floral Motifs. Okay, here's Color Box. Now before I do an analysis of how this looks, I'm going to go ahead and give it enough time to dry and move on to the next row, which is going to be a solid stamp. I'm using this flower from the Stampin' Up! Flower Patch set. Color Box. Here's the Hero Arts. Memento Luxe seems to be a little dry, even though literally I just opened the package. So let's just see how that stamps. The Simon Says Stamp, as well as the Color Box, was very, very juicy, whereas the Hero Hues and the Memento Luxe seemed a little bit drier, with the Memento being the most dry. So let's see how the Simon Says Stamp goes. Here's Stampin' Up! Nice. All right, one more row to do. I'm going to be using this Happy stamp from the Simon Says Stamp Happy and Smile set. Here's Color Box. Hero Arts, Memento Luxe, Simon Says Stamp, and finally Stampin' Up! Okay, so let's take a closer look at the results. Just kind of overall, I'd have to say that the Color Box and the Simon Says Stamp were the juiciest ones. They seemed the most liquidy. Stampin' Up! Seemed the thickest, like the most sticky. Memento Luxe seemed a little drier than the other ones, and the Hero Hues was kind of in the middle of all of those. So not too liquidy, not too sticky. So just kind of average. Now I just accidentally touched this Stampin' Up! One, and it is a little bit wet still, and that may be because it is the brightest. Anyway, so let's kind of go through each of these. The Color Box was very evenly colored, but it is kind of grayish. It's soaked into the paper, I think, because it's very juicy, and it created more of a gray image on this black cardstock. But it was all very even. The Hero Hues, you can see there's kind of parts that are a little bit whiter than others. It's much crisper, I think, because it's a little drier, whereas the Color Box kind of absorbed into the paper and spread a little bit, whereas the Hero Hues laid more on top of the paper. The Memento Luxe looks really good actually, and I've noticed that the ones that lay on top of the paper most are the ones that get kind of a line where it's kind of transparent in the middle, and then you kind of get an outline on both sides, kind of like you see it's accentuated in this gel pen here because it's running out of ink, but you could see in the middle of each line it's kind of dark. And it's kind of like that a little bit here with this Memento Luxe, but it is a pretty nice image that's been stamped very crisp. The Simon Says stamp was one of the juiciest, if not the juiciest. It seemed like it was, because it was liquidy, it's absorbing into the paper a little bit more. So there are a couple of dots up here, I'm not sure if you could see that, of white, but for the most part it's not very even across the image, and it's kind of grayish. So I would say that's probably last place. Surprisingly enough, I'm very surprised by this. The Stampin' Up! It's stamped really, really well, and I would say that this is probably the best. Now you're still getting kind of the white lines on each side with the dark in the middle of the image, but it is the prettiest, it is the whitest, it's the brightest, so I was really happy with the way this stamped. So that's the detailed image. Now the results for the solid image are pretty similar. So you look at the color box, and it's a little grayish. It's got a little bit of white here and there on the edges where it's kind of pushed outside the stamp when I stamped it down. But it's very even and kind of grayish across the whole thing. The Hero Hues is a little bit whiter, but the difference, again, as with the detailed image, is that it's crisper. So it doesn't look kind of faded on the edges. It looks very crisp on the edges. The Memento Luxe looks a little kind of cloudy, I guess, or kind of not very even coverage, and I did notice when I stamped it that it was dry, and I think that might be why you're getting kind of this blotchy look. But it is very crisp, similar to the crisp image that I got from the detailed image. The Simon Says stamp, very similar, interesting enough to the detailed, is that it's not even. So some areas are light, some are dark. I did get some squishing out of the ink, which is this white on the edge here, but it's not very bright. It's kind of faded. It's probably the most faded, and again, the most juicy. And then this Stampin' Up! Is the brightest. It's the most crisp. Well, okay, I'm not sure I'd say it's the most crisp. It's as crisp as the Memento Luxe, which I thought was crisp also. It is the brightest. It does give a little bit of a blotchy look, but I think I would prefer having a little bit of blotchiness so that I could get the brightness of the color. So if you kind of look at a glance at all of them, the Stampin' Up! One is definitely the brightest. All right, moving down to the sentiment. Again, pretty much the same results. I have kind of a spread out gray, not very crisp image for the color box. The Hero Hues is a little bit crisper. It's definitely crisper. It has kind of a white edge, but actually it's a really nice stamp, but it is a little bit grayish. The Memento Luxe has those kind of white edges to the sentiment, but it is crisp and it's whiter and brighter. The Simon Says stamp, again, uneven. Some areas have white, some are very grayish, not very crisp, like it's soaked into the paper. And then the Stampin' Up! Is the brightest. It has probably the most visible outline of white, if you could look at that and see that, but it is the brightest. So overall, I would say for stamping ability, I would rate Stampin' Up! As the best. My second choice would probably be the Memento Luxe wedding dress. Third, I would probably choose the Hero Hues unicorn. Fourth would be color box, and fifth would be Simon Says stamp. And this is very interesting because I have always used color box, and so this is really surprising to me because I was sort of under the impression that that had the best image, but really until you compare them side by side, you really can't tell. All right, so let's do a direct to paper test. Okay, so here's the chart that I'm going to use to do the direct to paper for each of these. So here's color box, Hero Hues, Memento Lux, Simon Says Stamp, Stampin' Up. Okay, I'm going to let that dry for a few minutes and then we'll analyze. Okay, so now that it's mostly dry, we can take a look. It's pretty obvious at first glance which one is the brightest and whitest. But let's go through each of them. So the color box, you can see that the width is very narrow. It's kind of a small ink pad, and it's also very thin. So when I did the Directive paper, I was hitting, well, you can see I was hitting it on here because it is so small. And I do find that it is hard to ink up a stamp with such a very short ink pad. But it is very gray. It's a little splotchy in areas, but yeah, it's pretty gray. I would probably rate this as not so great. Hero Hues is a little bit more consistent, as we've seen in the other stamping. So you get kind of a nice color all the way across, but it is more of a grayish color. It started out a little bit white, but then it started to get a little bit gray. It did get a little white at the end, but it's a little streaky, but it's really, it's kind of still just sort of gray, but a little crisper, you can tell. Now the Memento, I'm going to have to, let's see. The Memento Lux, I said earlier that it felt really dry, and again, I literally just opened the packaging right before this test. So you can see right here where there's kind of a new edge of white, and that's because it got stuck. So I was going along the paper, and then it was so dry that I actually had to kind of readjust and continue. So it's kind of even hard to tell what to think of this because of how dry it is. You can see the Hero Hues is just very solid all the way across, and then this sort of breaks up and is dry. The Simon Says Stamp, similar to the color box. We've seen a lot of those being very similar and comparable. A little splotchy. It's a little, it's thicker, obviously, and it's a little streakier, so not quite as even as the color box. But there's definitely splotches of color and streaks in the Simon Says Stamp. Not as opaque. And then the Stampin' Up is clearly the whitest, the brightest. You can see a line of color going across, but I think you're going to see that with anything because it's sticky. It's an opaque ink, so it's very thick, and so when it goes on, you're going to kind of see the lines of the ink pad. So anyway, overall, with this direct-to-paper test, I would rate I keep mixing those up, Stampin' Up as number one. It's hard to say. If I had a re-inker and I could really get a good, thick, juicy pad with the Memento Lux, I would guess that it would be second place, but I can't because it's so dry. So I would have to probably put the Hero Hues Unicorn White in second, and then the rest sort of fall away as third. So there you have the test. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that Stampin' Up! Came on top in both of the different tests because they do have great ink formulas. I did a dye ink comparison and it definitely came on top for that one as well. So I hope this helped you in making decisions on which white ink to buy. I'll see you next time.